Hello, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed some spectacular spring weather as I have the past few days. And it's been great to get out of the house and get some cycling in, some exercise in. It's always a mood booster. Anyway, this is Steve, the tour guide. Last week, we digressed from this series, Making Sense of the End Times, as I thought it would be remiss to miss addressing the holiday of Purim, which happened last week, actually on the very day that I addressed it with you guys. And today we're going to return to this series. Now, we left the book of Ezekiel, where we studied for 3 weeks the subject of Gog and Magog, and included, of course, reference to the book of Revelation. And now we're turning to the book of Joel. And this has potential to be one of the shortest of the studies that we do together. Now, we'll see if I'm able to keep that promise, but it does have that potential within it. After all, it's primarily concerned with merely 2 verses of Scripture, Joel chapter 3, verses 1 to 2. Now, let's look at it. For behold, in those days and at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. And I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people and my heritage Israel, because they have scattered them among the nations and have divided my land. Now, as far as Bible passages go, this couldn't be more to the point or simpler to decipher, starting with the time that it speaks of. Again, for behold, in those days and at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem. That time, folks, is now, okay, consistent with what we've read so far in Ezekiel. Joel, too, speaks of a future time when Yahweh restores the Jewish people to the land of Israel. We're living in the midst of that time. Now, moving on to the what, as we've just covered the when. Concerning the what, I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. The universality of the parties to this war couldn't be any clearer stated either. We're referring here to all the nations. Okay, now let's deal with the question of the where. It says here in Joel, it's going to take place in the valley of Jehoshaphat. Now, this valley is believed to be synonymous with the Kidron Valley, which separates Mount Moriah and Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. Now, this is confusing for some Christians because this valley is not the Valley of Armageddon, some 80 miles north of Jerusalem. That valley separates the region known as Samaria from that region known as the Galilee. Yet, throughout our study of Ezekiel's war of Gog and Magog, I argued that this war is synonymous with that war and the war of Zechariah chapters 12 through 14. And all of the above are synonymous with Revelation's Battle of Armageddon. The confusion is the seeming discrepancy concerning the venue of Joel's and Zechariah's war, both of which take place in Jerusalem, from that of Revelation's Armageddon, which is centered in Israel's north. Therefore, can all these be speaking of the same war? Yeah, because each of these prophetic books is describing the same war from a different vantage point. Evidently, that apocalyptic and final war of the age takes place on at least 2 different battlefields, as is the case with most wars that have been fought. Rarely does a war unfold entirely on one battlefield. One only needs to look to the contemporary Ukraine war and Israel's present seven-fronted war against Iran and its proxies. Both of these wars are singular wars unfolding across several battlefields. So, we are looking at one war comprising of at least two battlefields, one in the vicinity of Jerusalem, one in the Jezreel Valley, which is the more common name for the Valley of Armageddon of the book of Revelation. Now, why these two venues? Well, the battle in Jerusalem is obviously being fought over Jerusalem. This is even more clearly stated in Zechariah chapter 12, which refers to Jerusalem in the following language, and I quote here, "On that day, I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples." Okay, there we go again, the universality also. Okay, the global scale of this war. "All who lift it will surely hurt themselves, and all the nations of the earth will gather against it." Again, that's Zechariah chapter 12, verses 3 to 4. More elusive is that which pertains to the battle in the Jezreel Valley or Armageddon Valley, again, some 80 miles north of Jerusalem. Why that battle? Well, for those of us who know both the history and geography of the land of Israel, like those of us who are licensed tour guides, that one isn't really that elusive. You see, since time immemorial, the Jezreel Valley has been the key to conquering the land of Israel. It's the only valley that breaks up the long, continual mountain chain or hill country that runs the entire length of Israel like a spine, from its northern frontier with Syria and Lebanon down to its southern frontier on the Red Sea. That terrain is impossible to traverse with anything mechanized like ancient chariots or modern-day tanks. But the Jezreel Valley, also called Armageddon in the book of Revelation, is a valley that cuts right through those mountains from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. If you want to divide in order to conquer the land of Israel, you must do so via Armageddon or the Jezreel Valley, full stop. This is why the Arabs in both the 1948 and 1973 wars aspired to reach that valley at all costs. Now, Napoleon, who himself passed through this valley, and by the way, he was no student of biblical prophecy as we are, he said of that valley that it is the most natural battleground of the whole earth. He realized its strategic necessity without having to refer to the Bible. So, this is the context regarding these two venues of the final war of the age. Now, we have to ask, why is God hooking and dragging, per the language of Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39, the nations of the world to this war? The answer can be found in Joel chapter 3, verse 2. "I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people and my heritage Israel." Now here's the because they have scattered them among the nations and have divided up my land. There it is. It couldn't be stated more clearly. The tripwire, or the sin that the nations are going to be judged for in this final battle of the age, is the sin of dividing the land of Israel and scattering the Jewish people. Now, this syncs nicely with what we read in the beginning of Ezekiel chapter 36 a few weeks ago, when the enemy is quoted as saying, "Aha, the ancient heights have become our possession." Okay, that's Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 2. Now, this theme of dividing Yahweh's land, and notice he says it's his land, it's not even our land, the land of the Jews. He's given it to us. That's true. We're the tenants of the land, but he is the landlord. And this issue of dividing the land repeats itself over and over again over the past 100 years. Now, the British back in 1917 issued a declaration famously referred to as the Balfour Declaration, which basically states that the British, to whom the land has been entrusted following World War I, look with favor on the establishment of a Jewish homeland there in the land of Israel. Okay? And what would follow over the next 20 some years was known as the British Mandate, where the League of Nations, which is the UN's predecessor, gave the British the mandate to grandfather a Jewish state into existence per this Balfour Declaration of 1917. But unfortunately, quickly thereafter, the British learned that the Arab and Muslim worlds were not with this program at all. And eventually, the British would cave to Arab and Islamic pressure, namely in the form of oil, as well as the fact that there's many more Muslims and Arabs than there are Jews. And the British would renege basically on this Balfour Declaration, and they would greatly limit the immigration of Jews into the land of Israel. Most famously and most unfortunately, during World War II, the British Navy would blockade the shores of so-called Palestine from ships of Jews fleeing Hitler's Holocaust, and the British would prevent these ships from arriving to Palestine's shores. Now, the most famous ship, of course, was the Exodus, and there's a famous movie about it starring Paul Newman, and it's a great movie. I highly recommend it. It's called Exodus, and it is a very accurate depiction of the period. But the British ultimately reneged on this promise to grandfather a Jewish state into existence. And in 1937, we have the first of many attempts to divide the land. In 1937, the British form a committee called the Peel Commission, in which they plan to divide the land and give most of it to the Arabs and give the Jews just a small enclave that would comprise of what today is the Tel Aviv-Jaffa area. Now, mind you, this comes after the British gave something like 70 to 80% of historic Palestine to the Arabs to form a state called the Hashemite Kingdom of Transjordan, better known today as Jordan. So, the division of the land first in giving about 70 to 80% of it to the Jordanians, followed by the Peel Commission in 1937, which the Arabs rejected, thank God, followed by the United Nations 1947 dividing of the land, which the Arabs again rejected, followed by Israel's willingness to give up the territories it captured in the 1967 Six-Day War in exchange for some sort of peace, to which the Arabs famously in Khartoum, Sudan, issued their no to recognition of Israel, no to negotiating with Israel, no to any sort of peace with Israel. So again, in 1967, an attempt to divide the land. Then, most famously in my own day and your own day, watching this, the Oslo peace process, in which Israel agreed to bring the PLO, which was living in exile far away, safe from Israel's borders, or let's say Israel safely far away from the PLO, which was living in exile in Tunis, Tunisia, and in 1993 agreed to what was called the Oslo peace process to invite the PLO to establish a state within the state of Israel in historic Judea and Samaria. Now, of course, the Oslo peace process was to come to its conclusion in the year 2000 at Camp David under the auspices of Bill Clinton, and again, the Palestinians under the leadership now of Yasser Arafat decline, and they begin their terror war called the Second Intifada, which kills something like 1,100 or 1,200 Israelis in response to this final effort to make peace. The Arabs didn't even offer a counteroffer to Israel's offer to give them the whole of the West Bank, basically 95% of the West Bank, 100% of Gaza. And by the way, in exchange for the 5% of the West Bank or historic Judea and Samaria that Israel would keep, it was offering to give the Palestinians 5% from Israel's sovereign territory as a consolation prize. And the Palestinians again reject that. And as I said a minute ago, start their terror war, the Second Intifada, which I lived through between the years 2000 and 2004, experiencing many, many terror attacks in Jerusalem, one of which occurred right at the doorstep, literally, of my own apartment on Israel's, or let's say Jerusalem's most famous pedestrian road of those days, Ben Yehuda Street. What is the theme of each successive American administration until now? Divide the land of Israel. Again, divide the land of Israel. We hear this over and over again to the point of it becoming the formulaic solution by the UN, by the American State Department, and by the European Union. And here the book of Joel clearly says that the very tripwire that leads to this final battle of the age is this twofold sin of dividing the land of Israel in addition to having scattered the Jews abroad. Now, you could say to me, Steve, didn't Yahweh himself scatter the Jews abroad? We read that in the book of Ezekiel, and we did, okay? But elsewhere in the Bible, God says that the Gentiles went beyond his wildest dream of being that disciplinary rod that he wanted to use to discipline the Jewish people. In other words, the Gentiles went beyond their mandate. And as you look at our history as guests in places, particularly like Europe, culminating in the Holocaust, I think you would agree that Europe and the world at large went way beyond Yahweh's wildest dreams in their disciplining of the Jewish people on his behalf. And the theme that we're reading in these books and in these passages that we're covering in this series, Making Sense of the End Times, basically now has God reversing the roles and using latter-day Israel to discipline the nations, to discipline the Gentiles. For how the Gentiles relate to this issue of Israel is how God is going to relate to them. As the nations plan and do unto Israel, Yahweh is going to do unto them. And in doing so, as we've read in Ezekiel and elsewhere, in doing these things, Yahweh is trying to reveal to the world that he is the God of history. It's he who scattered Israel, and it's he who's restoring Israel. So there you have it, folks. In these first two verses of Joel chapter 3, we have the when, which is when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem. We have the what, which is I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. And we have the why, which is, and I will enter into judgment with them on behalf of my people and my heritage Israel, because they have scattered them among the nations and have divided my land. Now, I could easily end things here, as this is one of the most forward or to the point passages concerning the end times. But before we part ways, I'll refer also to the preceding chapter, Joel chapter 2, in order to point out some things that may strengthen my assertion that this war of Joel chapter 3 is synonymous with the Gog and Magog war of Ezekiel 38 and 39, which we studied to depth a couple of weeks ago. Okay, turning to Joel chapter 2, and I'm just going to read through it, and off the cuff here, as I notice similarities in language, in phraseology with passages that we've already read in the book of Ezekiel and the book of Revelation, I'll make reference to it in order to again buttress my argument or my assertion that this war of Joel is synonymous with that war of Ezekiel, which is synonymous with the war of Zechariah chapters 12 through 14, which is synonymous with the battle of Armageddon. So here we go. Blow a trumpet in Zion, sound an alarm on my holy mountain. Now, which mountain is God referring to here? None other than Mount Moriah of the Temple Mount, the holiest mountain, let's say, aside from Mount Sinai and all of the Bible. Okay, let's go. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. It is near, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness. Like blackness, there is spread upon the mountains a great and powerful people. Their like has never been before, nor will be again after them, through the years of all generations. Now, look right there. It's basically saying that this war and this gathering of fighters will exceed anything to have ever come before it, as well as anything to ever come after it. And therefore, there to me is a verse right there that establishes that this indeed is speaking of that final war of the age, also known as the Battle of Armageddon, but also known as Gog and Magog. Okay, let's continue now from verse 3. Fire devours before them, and behind them a flame burns. The land is like the Garden of Eden before them, but behind them a desolate wilderness. Now, this reference to the Garden of Eden may be referring to verses that we came across in Ezekiel chapter 36, referring to the land of Israel becoming this incredible, fruitful cornucopia again in this latter day. Perhaps that's what it's referring to, but it's a little bit more enigmatic here what that reference to Eden is referring to. Okay, now verse 4, their appearance is like the appearance of horses, and like war horses they run, as with the rumbling of chariots. They leap on the tops of mountains like the crackling of a flame of fire, devouring the stubble like a powerful army drawn up for battle. Before them, peoples are in anguish. All faces grow pale. Like warriors, they charge. Like soldiers, they scale the wall. They march each on his way. They do not swerve from their paths. They do not jostle one another. Each marches in his path, and they burst through the weapons and are not halted. They leap upon the city. They run upon the walls. They climb up into the houses. They enter through the windows like a thief. The earth quakes before them. The heavens tremble. The sun and the moon are darkened, and the stars withdraw their shining. Now, that language is very reminiscent of language that we've read both in Ezekiel and Revelation about the cosmic shudderings and consequences of this war. Okay, that this war is not just a local war in Israel, but it's breaking forth throughout the cosmos. We read in Ezekiel how mountains are overthrown. Okay, and the language here of the stars withdrawing their shining, the sun and the moon becoming darkened, again, reminiscent of language that we came across in both the book of Revelation as well as Gog and Magog. Okay, so there's this cosmic scale to this war. It's not just local in Israel. Okay, moving on with verse 11. The Lord utters his voice before his army, for his camp is exceedingly great. He who executes his word is powerful, for the day of Yahweh is great and very awesome. Now, there's a stock phrase that comes about in the Bible many times referring to that final battle or that final act of the age, which is also called, as it is here, the day of Yahweh, or the day of the Lord. And it continues to go on. Who can endure it? Yet even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting, with weeping, with mourning, and rend your hearts and not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and he relents over disaster. Who knows whether he will not turn and relent and leave a blessing behind him, a grain offering and a drink offering for the Lord your God. Blow the trumpet in Zion, consecrate a fast, call a solemn assembly, gather the people, consecrate the congregation, assemble the elders, gather the children, even nursing infants. Let the bridegroom leave his room and the bride her chamber. Between the vestibule and the altar, let the priests, the ministers of the Lord, weep and say, spare your people, O Lord, and make not your heritage a reproach, a byword among the nations. Why should they say among the peoples, where is their God? Now, this, of course, is reminiscent of what we read in Ezekiel chapter 36, where God says that to each of the places to which the Jews were sent among the Gentiles were basically quoted as saying something very similar to this. Where's their God, after all? These are Yahweh's people. This is Yahweh's nation, and they had to leave his land. Okay, so the very name of God is mocked among the Gentiles because of the Jewish turning down, or the downturning of Jewish fortunes. As it goes with Jewish fortunes, so it goes with the reputation of Yahweh. When we, the Jews, are doing well in the battlefield, as we've been doing the past several months, including the famous pager attack, many Gentiles are scratching their heads, saying, man, how can this be anyone or anything other than the Lord? This is so obvious of God, God empowering his people. But likewise, when the Jewish people find ourselves weak and scattered abroad, and as fuel to the fires, literally, of the Holocaust and Hitler's crematorium, it makes our God look pathetic. After all, he is Yahweh, the God of Israel. Where is he in all that? This isn't just something being said among the Gentiles. Among my own family, there's a lack of faith because of this event in history. My dad always says to me, Steve, where was God, the God of Israel, during this event, the Holocaust? How could he let 1/3 of his people be murdered? And not just murdered, but sadistically murdered. And I won't go into all the details of the sadism. It's there in the history books and the testimonies. But because of that, our God looked weak both to the Jew and Gentile. So again, here we see in Joel the Gentiles being quoted. Where is this Jewish God? And again, it reminds me of Pharaoh when he said, who is this Yahweh? I don't know him. Why would the Pharaoh look up to the God of his slave population? So again, as it goes with the fortunes of the Jews, so it goes with the fortunes of the reputation of the God of the Jews, Yahweh. Okay, moving on. And here we go. Picking it up from verse 18 of Joel chapter 2, again, echoing something we read in Ezekiel chapter 36. Then the Lord became jealous for his land and had pity on his people. The Lord answered and said to his people, behold, I am sending to you grain, wine, and oil, and you will be satisfied, and I will no more make you a reproach among the nations. I will remove the northerner far from you and drive him into a parched and desolate land, his vanguard into the eastern sea, which, by the way, is the biblical way of mentioning the Dead Sea. And again, reminiscent of what we read in Gog and Magog, for it says somewhere in Ezekiel 38 or 39 that the soldiers and hordes of Gog and Magog will be buried right there by the eastern sea, or Dead Sea. So again, another echoing of the language here, or some themes of Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39, referring to Gog and Magog, although here not by name, okay? And his rear guard to the western or Mediterranean Sea. The stench and foul smell of him will rise, for he has done great things. Fear not, O land. Be glad and rejoice, for the Lord has done great things. Fear not, you beasts of the field, for the pastures of the wilderness are green. The tree bears its fruit. The fig tree and vine give their full yield. Be glad, O children of Zion, and rejoice in the Lord your God, for he has given the early rain for your vindication. He has poured down for you abundant rain. The early and latter rain is before. The threshing floor shall be full of grain, the vat shall overflow with wine and oil, and I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten, the hopper, the destroyer, and the cutter, my great army which I sent among you. You shall eat in plenty and be satisfied, and praise the name of the Lord your God, who has dealt wondrously with you. And my people shall never again be put to shame. Again, explaining how this war is the great divider of the ages. The world and the Jewish people will never be the same following this war. This is not just another war, but it is the end of one age and the gate or opening to the subsequent age, which of course you and I believe to be the millennium. Again, I repeat this verse, and my people shall never again be put to shame. And you shall know that I am in the midst of Israel, and that I am the Lord your God, and there is none else. And my people shall never again be put to shame. This is not just another war, okay, but this is a divider between ages. Okay, moving on now to verse 28. And again, we're going to see a theme here that echoes what we've already read in Ezekiel chapter 36 and Ezekiel chapter 37, the pouring out of the Spirit of God. And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. Even on the male and female servants in those days, I will pour out my Spirit, and I will show wonders in the heavens and on the earth, blood and fire and columns of smoke. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and awesome day of Yahweh comes. And it shall come to pass that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. For in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there shall be those who escape, as the Lord has said, and among the survivors shall be those whom the Lord calls. Now, that seems to be a reference to this theme again that pops up in so many places in the Bible, the remnant of the Jewish people. This is a theme that goes back to the book of Isaiah. If you remember, Isaiah was told to name one of his sons. The remnant will return. In Hebrew, Sha'ar Yeshuv. So Isaiah not only prophesied about this remnant, but one of his sons was so named to buttress that prophecy. And of course, in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul refers to this latter-day remnant of the Jewish people who come to this national reconciliation with Yahweh, also prophesied in Zechariah chapters 12 through 14. Okay, it just repeats itself. Springs itself up in many passages of the scripture, this theme of the remnant that gets saved at the very end of the age. Now, we don't know how many of us are going to be part of that remnant. In other words, how many of us, known as the Jews today, are reserved for that remnant. Only God knows. But you couldn't be any clearer. And here, as I've just read in Joel chapter 2, a lot of themes that we've covered thus far in other books concerning that final war in the age repeat themselves. Now, granted, Joel does not provide us with the chronology that Ezekiel does, which makes Ezekiel really head and shoulders above all the other prophets, and that Ezekiel not only prophesies these things, but he also puts them in order for us. Between basically Ezekiel chapter 36 and the end of the book, Ezekiel presents the chronology of the end times, from the regathering of the Jewish people to the land, to the pouring out of the Holy Spirit upon the whole of the Jewish nation, to this battle of Gog and Magog, or Armageddon, followed by the final chapters of Ezekiel that refer in great detail to millennial Israel and the millennial temple on the Temple Mount. So there you have it, guys. I said it had potential to be one of my shorter lessons, but in the end, it was just as long as the others because I didn't want to cut the quality short. And I hope you enjoyed this lesson. I want to thank all of you who've contributed to my coffee fund and my coffee drinking by way of my Ko-fi page, which I link to the extended description of every video below the video. Thank you all for your kind attention. I'm now going to let you go, and I'll see you next week as we continue to Zechariah chapters 12 through 14. Bye-bye.